is Katie Deering. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the secondary literacy content coach at Region 11. So working mostly with middle school and high school teachers. I've done a little bit with intermediate this year. Before I was in this role, I was a high school teacher for a really long time. And I did have a very small juncture of time that I was in elementary and 1 year of pre-K that we really don't talk about. Try to block that out as much as possible. And then Lauren, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Lauren Smith at Region 11. My role is delivering job embedded PD to teachers called Texas Lesson Study, where we dive deep into research and implement that research into our classroom to change our practices a little bit for better learning outcomes. And I spent many years in the LA classrooms through 12th. I've got little bits and pieces of different things in English, so of ELA.
And so we are going to just go through some meeting norms to make sure that we're all on the same page. And again, if you've been on here with us before, this is a little redundant, but I think it's important that we just make sure we're all normed this way. Again, making sure that you've introduced yourself. I've already seen some relationships being built with people who are logging on to these webinars multiple times, getting to know each other, asking each other questions. So the chat is a great place for you to engage with other people and ask them questions, what they're doing, and to share things that are working for you. Please make sure that your audio is muted until we go into a breakout session or until debriefing or sharing. If for some reason, we get it, life happens, right? I have a dog and a first grader that at any time could try to make noise in the background. As much as I've, bribed and threatened for this hour of time, please don't interrupt. But it is what it is, so we understand. But keeping it on mute really helps us to make sure that that recording is clean. And then as you have questions, type those into the chat. If it's something that's very specific to you and your needs, Lauren and I will be tag teaming, and just when I'm talking, she'll be manning the chat and vice versa. And we can be responsive to those questions in the moment, but then some of those questions might really benefit the group. So we might be able to share those out as well. Lauren is going to share, if she hasn't already, Lauren's going to share our Google attendance form link. And so you want to make sure that at some point during this webinar, you fill that link out so that you'll be able to get credit. That's how we're taking attendance for the session. And so we'll share that now. We'll also share it at the very end. So if you don't want to mess with it until the end, that's fine as well. Okay. So we are going to get going. So we thought that a good way to start the day would just to be kind of embracing our humanity in this a little bit. Lauren and I both are not coming to you with all of the grading answers, and we're not claiming that we've always done the right thing in the way that we have administered grades. And so we want to give you a chance to share some of your grading fails in the chat box, and we'll maybe pick a couple to share out loud. And I'll kick us off and just kind of get started. And so know that I must really trust you to tell you, because as teachers, we don't like to talk about the things that we did poorly, I think a lot of times. My first year of teaching, I was teaching junior English, and I was on a team where I was a baby. I turned 22 the week before school started. And then everyone else on my team hated teaching and were like counting down to retirement. And so all of the assignments that I was giving my kids were mandated by the team of, we're all doing this, we all have to assign this. So I assigned a Scarlet Letter project because we were reading the Scarlet Letter, because that's what you do. And the students were going to create their own letter for whatever habit that they feel like they were known for, bad habit. And they had to wear it all day, and the teachers had to sign off that they wore it. Well, my rubric for that assignment was so ridiculously subjective, of like how much time you spent creating your letter, like did it look nice? And so I had kids that were like, why did I make an 85 and Johnny made a 90? And I couldn't even articulate, well, it looked like he used hot glue on it. And I didn't really have a good answer. It was just that I liked Johnny's better than yours. And so like, I think back to that being such an unclear assignment. What did that have to do at all with them actually learning anything about the book? And so that's one of my grading fails. Lauren, do you want to share one of yours? You're on mute.
I'm muted. Yes, I think mine is just kind of more of a, I think internet's unstable, so sorry, y'all. I think mine's more of just broad over, our thing was the first several years of my career, I definitely, as an ELA teacher, thought about that creativity, aspect of a rubric as being something that I could grade. And I learned as the year went on that it was an unfair thing to include creativity since that wasn't a part of my standards. So I feel like that was kind of a big part of my failure in the early years of just learning how to navigate, still allow creativity without it being attached to such a grade.
Tamara, is it Tamara or Tamara? Do you want to share yours about your boxer?
Okay, so he was a puppy, and when I guess he was probably about 3 or 4 months old, and I brought home a stack of papers. It was towards the beginning of the school year, it was right after the first of the year, and I brought home the stack, and I had left them in my office, and I had gone out to eat. And when I came back home, like, I saw little pieces of paper shredded all over the house, and he had taken all of the assignments. He had eaten part of them, had shredded the other part, and so I was like, oh crap, what am I gonna do? So I finally just said, oh well, I'm gonna give everybody 100 and move on with life. It was a lot easier.
That's hilarious that the dog literally ate the homework. Like, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
It wasn't them using that excuse, it was me.
That's awesome. Laura, I saw in the chat talking about your independent reading projects. Do you want to share that with us, Laura Callahan?
Hi. So I did independent reading projects. It was a project idea I got from another teacher. This is my first year, so this has been kind of a weird year. But basically, I gave them a variety of things. They could read whichever book they wanted. It had a certain number of pages, and they could either do a paper, a poster, a movie board, creative writing, a poetry book, anything like that. But I would have students that would, last minute, very obviously, throw together a drawing packet in an hour, and then I'd have kids who weren't very talented at drawing, honestly, and then have kids who spent a lot of time on it, but say, I can't give you a great grade because your drawings aren't great, so you should have picked a different project. So that was something I kind of struggled with, learning how to grade those fairly.
Absolutely. And I think, bless your heart that this is your first year teaching. Like, what a roller coaster that must have been. And it'll only get better. It'll only get better. So many things that I did in the name of creativity, I think that I ended up being so subjective that there was really no way to do that fairly. So I definitely feel that. And then let's do one more. Adrian, or is it Adrienne? I want to pronounce it correctly. Do you want to share yours?
Sure. Yeah, it's Adrian. I unfortunately have done this way more times than I like admitting. And it's happened multiple times since we've been in this online learning environment that I will go through, like I have 200 kids, so I'll grade the first 100 and I'll be very, very strict and critical in my grading, and I will hold them to the standard that I need them to be at, and then I'll forget about the rest, and I'll think, oh my gosh, I have to get the rest of them done, and I'll just fly through those, and all of a sudden I'll realize that the first group is all 70s, 80s range, then all of a sudden everybody else in the last batch are in the 90s, so then I have to go back through and readjust everybody's grades. So it takes twice as long, but after 5 years of teaching, I haven't learned to not do that yet.
Well, Adrian, it looks like in the chat that people are resonating with that. So I think that we've all been there where you have that momentum when you pick up the fresh stack and you're just going for it, and then you're so over it by the end that who knows where the points come from. It's like, whose line is it anyways, right? The points don't matter. So I think people feel that. So I think that that's important that we all kind of are coming into this with that idea of the fact that we have committed some grading fails, and that grading is something that people really don't often talk about as far as looking at intentional practices. I think it's one of those things that is something that we think is easy and it comes naturally, but then it's something that can really affect a student in a negative way. So we're going to be talking a lot about that in this next part. So we're going to break into some breakout rooms. If you've never used a breakout room in Zoom, it's very easy. In a second, you'll see a little prompt that says that you're being asked to join a breakout room, and you'll just click that. Yesterday, we had some tech issues with breakout rooms where people were getting kicked out. So I'm not going to be popping in this time. I'm just going to make sure everybody gets situated. And if for some reason you get kicked out and need to come back in, I'll admit you really quickly, and then I'll put you in a room. But we're just going to talk for like 2 to 3 minutes, very briefly, about the words grading and harm, and really trying to analyze and investigate how those two terms are related. How is it possible for grading to cause harm, either to a student or to a class environment or to a teacher or to a campus? You can think about it in any terms really that you want, but I want you to just talk in your group, and we're going to have very small groups, so groups of about 4, and we're going to just chat for 2 to 3 minutes. So you're going to see that prompt here in a second. I'm going to have you into 4 rooms, and those rooms are now open. Still waiting on a couple more people to trickle back in, about 4 more people. And so we're just going to go room by room and have your spokesperson for your room just to talk about some of the things that you said as a group. So we'll start with breakout room 1. If we could have your spokesperson, how are grading and harm related? And make sure you're not muted. Breakout room 1, anybody?
Well, that's my dog. We had discussed that it's kind of finding the fine line between pass and fail, and you don't really want to tank their self-esteem by giving them the grade that they earned, because a lot of people find their academic worth in the numerical grades that they receive.
I like that. I think a lot of our kids who are very compliance driven as well, and kids that are perfectionists, or again, like what you said, finding that worth with that number, that's really hard, and you have to kind of balance what are they truly earning versus how that makes them feel. Okay, what about breakout room 2? Breakout room 2, what did y'all talk about?
We talked about three different areas. We talked about how a lot of times grading is considered punitive for students, and it becomes harmful when students are not really getting a reflection of what they know in terms of the content. We also talked about how it's punitive because sometimes grading can be harmful for students when they're not clear on what did I get and how did I earn it. And then if it's not giving to a point where students are understanding and measuring growth, that can also be harmful for students.
I love that, Catherine. I think that's spot on, is looking at unclear criteria, and then do the numbers in the grade book really truly correlate with what a student can do? And if not, then what does that do with the student, right? And so I think that that's so important, especially when we're looking at actually like what content we're teaching during a grading period, and then looking at the grades and finding that correlation there. So I think those are all really good points. Breakout room 3, talk to me.
This is Jennifer. So we talked about, just like again with the good kids looking for I hate saying that word, good kids, but the ones looking for compliance and just to make things happy. But we also talked about how in negative, sometimes those kids that don't believe in themselves, they're like, see, I told you I'm not good at this, blah, and use it as a crutch instead of using it as a stepping stone. Even with the compliant kids, they just use it for a grade, and whereas we're trying to encourage them to think of it as a stepping stone for rooms for improvement.
And Jennifer, so I want to touch on what you just said, because you said good kids, and then you were like, ooh, I hate that I even said that. I even think, and I'm speaking from my own personal bias and experience, I think that sometimes grades will shape how we view kids.
Absolutely.
Right? And so, and that's not an intentional thing. It's not a malicious thing on our part, but I think that sometimes those grades in the grade book will correlate to, we see that these kids love school, or that they're good at school, and then these kids don't, whereas that might not really be the case. And so I think that that's interesting. And it also really feeds into that compliance mentality that you're talking about, of kids doing something to get a grade versus to learn. So thank you for sharing that. Breakout room 4, will y'all share?
Ours goes right into that. We were talking about putting aside what we know of this child or the student, and being able to actually grade what they know, and not grade based on how they participate in class, or how they are, either a compliant kid or a non-compliant kid. And actually, when you're grading essays or things that are more subjective, putting that aside and just focusing on how did they show that they know this. I have trouble with that.
Yeah. And I think that that's a really good question that we're going to be trying to address today, is how do those really truly reflect and correlate what students know? And how do we make that, how do we make grades meaningful, right? And then we had a breakout room 5, yes? Breakout room 5? Did we? Yes, maybe. Okay. Well, I thought we did for some reason. Well, y'all debrief me in the chat if something's going on and somebody needed to get up and get a drink of water or something. But here are some things when Lauren and I were talking about this. Here are some things that kept coming up. And the title of this session was intentional. I was in a PD environment with Kelly Gallagher, Penny Kittle, and Kylene Beers on Facebook. Kylene Beers has been doing, or she did it first, I don't know if she's still doing it now, daily chats with different literacy experts and people in the field. And she and Penny Kittle and Kelly Gallagher were doing this Facebook conversation, and they were talking about grades during this time. And Kelly Gallagher said probably 4 or 5 times that his mantra during this time is grade without harm. And that just really connected with me and resonated with me about just that intentionality of grades and being very mindful about what grades mean to students, to parents, to teachers, to the bigger scope of accountability, and how can we make our grading policies and practices as much as we can control, right? How can we really try to ensure that those grades do mean something in the scope of the learning and that they impact students in a positive way? And so here are ways that we kind of talked about how grades might be harmful. I think a lot of times we use grades as a gotcha or a way to manage behavior. I know one way that I have done this in the past, and if you've never worked with me, by the way, I'm very much vulnerable. I can't ever pretend like I have it all together. So I will always admit the things that I have done in the pursuit of doing better. So I'm sorry if that damages my street cred a little bit, but it is what it is. I used to, when kids were absent, I'd put the 0 in the grade book right ahead because I was like, they're not going to turn it in unless they see that 0 in there. There's much, much better ways to do that, but I would use that 0 as a way to get kids to do work. Or when we think about the quizzes that we assign for reading, that they're not necessarily to assess knowledge of content, but it's to get the kids to read. And so we use that a lot of times as a way to manage behavior. Again, about this a little bit is that idea of unclear criteria, where when we give a very subjective rubric or the criteria in the rubric is very broad, very subjective, then students really don't know how to be successful at the task, which then is negative when they receive negative feedback in the form of a grade for something that was really on us. And that muddies the water in what we're really seeing kids capable of performing. Another thing that's really important when we're thinking about grading doing harm is if what we're grading isn't necessarily aligned with the standards or if it's super subjective. So things in your rubric that's about neatness, creativity, those kinds of things that aren't measurable, that don't align with the learning, we really need to think about what message that sends our students in what is more important in school. I know I had a student as a senior who was very GT and would very much talk about the system. And that's something that he talked about all the time, about the game of school. And he was like, I just want to look at all of my grades and see how many of these grades actually reflect things that I was supposed to learn versus things that my teacher wanted to make a cute project, or things that were important to school games, not necessarily the content. So those things can be very harmful as well. Another thing that I think we have to admit to ourselves is sometimes our grading is influenced by some outside factors, biases that we have, prejudices, or even what we would consider good and normal, right? So I want us to understand that the word bias isn't a dirty word. It's not saying that you're a bad person. Everybody has bias. If I were to ask everybody to think about, if you were to imagine in your head a scientist, picture him or picture her. See what I did? What would you do? I think a lot of us might draw like an old Einstein looking man. And that's because in our brain, that's the image that comes to mind. when we think of that word. And that's because of the bias that we have formed from our life experience. And when I say prejudices, I'm even thinking about things about student behavior. If you have a kid that's constantly disrespectful or acting up all the time, sometimes we don't intend on those things playing a part of some of that subjective grading, or we know that that kid did it at the last minute. That can influence the grades that we put together. Kind of like what we were sharing in the grading fails chat, is how we feel about the assignment affects the grades that we give, right? Our own emotional state, our own fatigue can affect those numbers sometimes, or even what we would consider good when we think about a project. You know, what we would imagine a creative project would be. What is the norm for that? That can sometimes influence the numbers that we put down. And then I think too, if the criteria is beneficial to some kids but not all kids, that's definitely an area of harm. When we think about outside work that requires kids to purchase supplies or requires kids to work outside of school with each other, when we have that criteria, that's beneficial to the kids who have the money to do that, have the means to do that, have the transportation to go to each other's house to work collaboratively if they need to. I remember on my campus, a physics teacher did a really fun, cool project about a catapult, where they were building a catapult and they were going to have a contest to see who could chunk the pumpkin the furthest. And the kids that, you know, could go to Home Depot and buy all of the different parts, and they spent more than $100 on their catapult. Man, it was impressive. But what do you do when you don't have the means to do that? And how can you still show your learning? So those are some things that I think are important to consider when we're looking at ways that our grading can be harmful to students. So now we're going to shift in. Let me see. Is there any questions or comments in the chat that we need to address, Lauren?
No, I'm just responding to some of the comments. So people have had some really good comments about other grading fails and what we've been guilty of, you know. Yeah.
Awesome. So we want to make sure as well, moving forward, that we have a really clear understanding about grading and assessment, because a lot of times we tend to merge those two terms, whether it's intentional or unintentional, to say, oh yeah, I'm assessing my students. Look at all of these grades that I have in the grade book. And we use that grading data as kind of gospel when we're looking at things with like RTI and what kids need when we're going to those ARD meetings and such. And we use that grading as our assessment data, but we want to make sure that we understand those. So we're going to try something a little interactive, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but we're going to go for it. So Lauren is about to put a link in the chat, and the link is going to take you to a Google slide card sort. Okay, so you're going to see this exact image about how are these terms different with some movable cards. And we just want you to move around those cards to see what would describe grading versus what would describe assessment. So Lauren's going to put that link in the chat, and I'm going to put 4 minutes on the timer, and then we're going to come back together and we're going to debrief that. So if you want to stop your video, you can. If you want to minimize this and do that sort of, then come back to us. We're going to do that in 4 minutes. So we're just going to try it. We're going to try to make this a little more interactive. We'll see how it goes.
Lauren, I think you might have shared the wrong link.
It is wrong link. I'm sorry. Hang on. That was Grady. You'll need that one too. So later, let me fix the right one. Sorry about that. I copied the wrong thing.
You're good.
There we go. Got it. There you go. That should work. Did that work?
I'm seeing nods, Lauren. Couple more minutes. And if you want to signal to us that you did the sort and you're finished, if you want to put like a thumbs up reaction, if you know how to do that on Zoom, that would be a good signal to us. About one more minute. Okay, I've seen a few thumbs up here and there from people. Go ahead and start wrapping up and coming back to the screen. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and end this timer so that it doesn't yell at us. So we're going to debrief that a little bit, and some of these overlap. And so I want to give the disclaimer of it's almost like the idea of a square versus a rectangle, right? That a rectangle can't be a square, but a square can be a rectangle, right? So when we think about grades and assessment, that relationship is the same. So, but it is important to kind of get that clearer picture. When we look at assessment, okay, it's really what we're using to measure student learning. We're looking at multiple factors. We're looking at lots of different data points to determine if students are mastering something. And we're looking at those multiple data points to identify and analyze student needs. So grades alone aren't really giving us that clear picture of assessment. We're looking at anecdotal data. We're looking at student work samples. We're having conversations with kids. We're looking at lots of different things when we're talking about assessment. And assessment is strategic. It's something that we do not just for compliance of our job, but it's something that we use specifically to shape, inform, and differentiate instruction. Whereas when we're looking at grades, it's one way, right? One for an educator to evaluate a student's performance in learning. That might look like a letter grade. It might look like a pass-fail. It might look like a percentage. It can be attached to physical tasks that they do or some subjective things that a teacher might feel is important to the learning experience. Participation grades, everybody did it, so everybody gets 100. Effort, how hard you worked on something. And so we want to make sure just that we differentiate that before we move forward. Any questions or comments on that? No? Okay. So Lauren's going to share a little bit of just some research around grading practices that we're going to be considering.
And research gets me really excited, you guys, because it's a huge part of my job. But I won't drone on about it, but research is extremely important when we're looking at best practices. And, you know, I feel like sometimes we don't talk about those things enough. And so this got me very excited. So just to kind of piggyback off of what Katie said about assessment versus grading, the more and more research I do on this and implement it with teachers or have teachers implement it, I've learned, you know, assessment is a mindset, right? It's more like a philosophy. Grading sometimes has that, we have to grade, but it sometimes has that negative connotation. So I just really feel like assessing has a better, you know, it comes out better for me. But I think about assessment for learning versus assessment of learning. And so in order to build capacity in yourselves and your students, assess them before grading so that that criteria is clear, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute a little bit more. But just to kind of break down some of the research, you can read what's on your screen. But John Hattie is a huge researcher in education, and he has researched for like 3 decades and done like 800,000 studies. And so one of his effect sizes on student achievement is he deems 0.4 effect size pretty good. So this has a 1.44 effect size where students self-report their grades. And then even higher than that is where teachers can predict student achievement based on, but that's assuming that teachers know their students really well. So when students are able to kind of assess themselves and say, this is what I predict of my success rate on something, then they tend to do better because they can set more clear-cut goals for themselves. And it really does help them. The research all points to that. Students truly value feedback over grades. They really want to work with their teacher in order to receive feedback before they get a final grade. You know, I've been completely guilty of this. Okay, here's my grading fail, my biggest one. I think not giving them the rubric ahead of time. Or even co-creating some criteria with my students so that they understand what's truly, interactive. Sorry, I was reading the chat real fast. But I really believe that, students want that peer-to-peer feedback and they want teacher feedback, and all of the research points to that. So as much of feedback as you can give them prior to giving them a final grade, it's really going to improve the equity in your classroom. And all the research points to grading really has no statistical impact on student achievement. It's more about stressing the progress over the product and the growth. So the more and more we can engage our students in understanding the criteria that we're putting in front of them, or even, again, co-creating some of that criteria with students, it tends to work out better in the end. So I would say minimize the time and intellectual energy on grading and maximize the time and intellectual energy on feedback. Most students who are motivated by grades have had previous positive experiences. So we know that a lot of kids come to our classrooms with trauma from grades. And so the more equitable we can be in our grading, meaning let's align our grading to our standards and to our curriculum rather than what we deem as, again, good work. And I think that if we can just cut a lot of that out, we're doing good. We're doing a good job. So it's like baby steps, right? And let's see what else I was going to say. 2 of the highest predictors of student achievement, right, are those self-reported grades and also that feedback and teacher and student working together. So Brene Brown always says clear is kind, right? And so the clearer you are within the criteria, the clearer the student is on how to be successful and achieve mastery. Vague criteria does harm, clear criteria does all kinds of good. And I don't know if you're reading or if you've heard of the book, The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler. It's a pretty new book on the market, and she really talks about the Matthew effect. Kids that come from abundance tend to have more abundance. Kids that their parents tend to be educated, tend to be, on that continuum of being more educated. So the more we can be, again, equitable in our grading practices, the better off our students will be. So stress that progress and knowledge, building over standardized grading to increase that equity, I think so.
And so when we take all of that into consideration, I saw in the chat a lot of people really wanting, well, then how do we do that? If I've got 200 kids, how do I do this in a meaningful way? And what does that look like? So we're going to address that next. So, yes.
Katie, I forgot about that grading template really fast. Is that okay? I think I put that, I'll relink it and we can come back to that if we want to, but.
And then in the next slide, we have a hyperlink to it. So
Okay.
they'll have access to it. So yes, we are going to provide you with a planning template that you can kind of use to help you be intentional in thinking through some of these things. So when we're talking about grading, I think it's important that we as teachers, just like our students need that clear criteria, we need clarity as well on what should look like and should not look like. So here are just a couple of things to keep in mind when we're talking about the principles of grading. And the first of that is that not every piece of work needs to be graded. Grading fatigue is a real thing, just kind of like what we were talking about when you have a stack of 200 essays and that's just one assignment. And every time you're going home, you're dragging your cart home again, jiggity jig, and those papers sit there, and then you get mad at the children because they put the papers somehow there, right? That's not healthy for any of us. And so being intentional on thinking ahead of time on what you're going to take a grade on and what you're not. And if you find that students won't do the work if they're not receiving a grade for it, then I think that speaks to a behavior issue or a class culture issue that you can handle in a different way other than grades. And we can kind of talk about that in the Q&A piece. Another thing that we need to think about is not every assessment needs a grade attached. So when we look at where we're getting our information, how we are shaping the picture of the individual, some of those assessments are a little bit more informal. Some of those are us getting a snapshot of some of the work that they've done in a journal. Some of it could be conferencing with a student and writing down some goals. So not every single assessment has to be graded. Another thing to think about is not just focusing on one piece of writing or one text. So what I mean by that is I think a lot of times, specifically in the ELAR world, we get very literacentric, meaning we really get focused in on the novel or the short story or the article of whatever. And so when I'm teaching students at my TEKS, I'm wanting to make sure when I'm assessing them that they are mastering that skill, not just knowing how to do it within one body of text, but being able to, let's just say, analyze characters. I don't want them to only be able to analyze the characters from To Kill a Mockingbird. I want them to be able to analyze characters when they read a text. So when we're looking at giving kids opportunities to practice those skills and we're assessing that skill, if we're assessing kids on one text and that's the only experience that they're getting with that skill, then that really isn't a true assessment of mastery. It's they mastered it with this one text, which then translates into that frustration when we go to do it again later in the year and it's as though they've forgotten how. Or when the teacher of the next grade level says, you didn't teach them X, Y, Z because they can't do it. They were learning how to do it within just one context. And that's going to be the same for writing. When we're looking at writing, if the only type of text they're ever writing is a star 26-line essay, the transfer of those skills, of them being able to master those writing skills, you're not going to see that when we go into a different genre of writing or a different piece of writing. So being able to practice with multiple texts, focusing on multiple types of text when we're really truly looking at mastery and practice, I think is going to be really important. And I've said mastery about 16 times. That next principle is really big, that grades should reflect mastery, specifically the mastery of TEKS. So doing a little bit of a self-assessment there, I think is good. I would encourage all of you, while you still have access to your grade books, to go back to a grading period. So like a 6 weeks or a 9 week in the fall, where we were face-to-face, everything was traditional, normal, happy, and just look at the things that you took a grade on and then compare that to what TEKS students were expected to master during that time and see how those grades correlate and see if there were any grades that you took that really weren't connected to any kind of mastery. Because what we want our grading to do is to give a true and accurate picture of learning, okay? And then this last one is something that I am very, very passionate about. I want to shout it to the rooftop, shout it to the people in the back, is that students should not be assessed or graded on anything that they have not been able to practice in something that is low stakes or low risk, or on anything that they haven't self-assessed. So when we teach them something, then they do something and we immediately take a grade on that. I want us to think about what that would be like in our own job environment, right? As teachers, we are assessed not on the first day of school. We are assessed a couple of times throughout the year, right? I know how I felt, and probably all of us have been in that situation where you get your T-test evaluation like the day before spring break or something like that, and how unfair that feels, and how we feel like that's not maybe an accurate depiction of what we do. So if kids haven't had an opportunity to practice a skill, then what we're grading is not mastery, we're grading practice. We're grading that first learning, and we're expecting them to achieve mastery based on our one lesson that we've taught. So when we think about what that could look like, being intentional and doing some backwards design, which we'll talk about here in a second, of planning what we're grading in advance, and then thinking through how am I going to provide some opportunities to practice that skill before I actually take the grade, and what will that look like? And that is something that will really reshape the culture of your classroom. And it's something that we almost have to teach kids how to expect. If they have been brought up in that compliant based, I do this to get a grade kind of mentality, that we have to shape that culture a little bit, and we have to shape student expectations of what school takes place, and that fostering that culture of learning. So Lauren, what's going on in the chat? Are there any other questions that we can maybe talk?
Yeah, I think I need to get the ELAR page link unless you've got it open. People want to know where you're posting the videos. So I said they'll be on your Region 11 page, right?
I have not posted the videos yet. I am working on that pretty diligently. I'm just learning how to be a webmaster a little bit and trying to find the best way to host these videos. So if you're on the secondary literacy listserv, I will send out a link to some of those videos soon, or you can just email me and I can post it when that link is available.
And the other comment that I thought was important, just Adrian said, grading for mastery is so hard for me. I'm trying my hardest to get there, but I end up feeling so awful when kids are getting 30s, 40s, and 50s, but are trying so hard. Just one of the things, and I saw somebody else talk about the feedback, and I know Katie, we've got some sessions coming up that talk about those things, specifically with reading and writing. But if you are familiar with assessment for learning practices, and I can send you a resource. I work with Denton ISD teachers pretty closely, and some of the practices that they use to build stamina and capacity in kids for grades is pretty amazing. So assessment for learning stuff is all over the internet. It's very research-based. And I'm not saying that doesn't solve all the problems, but it's just one strategy, or it's multiple strategies that you can use. And one of the other things that I'd say grading for mastery is it does take time, I think, to kind of build some of these things up, and it takes practice for both us and for our kids. So give yourself some grace, because I think it takes most of us years to kind of perfect grading for mastery. But I will say this, again, the clearer you are in your criteria, and the clearer you are with your objectives, and your, aligning your grading to your learning targets and TEKS, the better off you are. So that grading template, I'm going to post it one more time in case you didn't see the link, but that's what we're about to go on to. And Katie and I just wanted to give you something a little tangible and concrete to take away. And this it forces you to make a copy, and please feel free to change anything on it if it doesn't work for you. But I want to tell you why we created it the way that we did, and what's valuable about it. And it does back up the research. So one of the things to consider, if you pull up the template, and I'll kind of go over these points as you're looking at it, how many grades do you need for each grading period? What categories? And I think a lot of times we are managing 200 students. We are grading 5,000 essays. We are putting out fires. We're a counselor. We're a mom to a lot of our kids. There's a lot of things going on, and sometimes we don't always think ahead and say we know how many grades we should be taking, but for each category, like summative, formative, reading, writing, projects, that kind of thing. And then next, what skills are you covering that students are expected to master during this grading period? So looking at your scope and sequence or your curriculum or TEKS resource system, whatever you use, what are the skills that align with my standards that I'm teaching? And so that's kind of how I figure out exactly what grades I need to be taking. And they need to be aligned to the skills. And then how will I truly assess the mastery of these skills? And what I mean by assessment before I grade is like, where are the checkpoints going to be? How can kids get feedback prior to receiving that final grade? And I know that there's been questions about feedback because it is so hard as a secondary teacher to get to every kid the way that you want to. But if you want to stay on afterwards, I'm sure Katie and I would love, we would be more than happy to talk you through some of those things. Or you can email us and reach out either way.
Absolutely. And I want to piggyback on what Lauren is saying about mastery. This is really like maybe, and I don't want to oversimplify because I know that this is a question that's popped up in the chat a couple of times. One simple thing that I will do sometimes is I just do some visualization of what would it look like if this high school student had mastered this. Like, let's take a TEK about metacognition or making predictions or something like that. I'm like, what would that look like when they're reading? What would that look like in their writing? What would that look like? Do I have a student sample that maybe I've seen before that really showed that knowledge? And how would I know that? What would mastery look like? Is that something that I can assess in a multiple choice question? Or is that something that I'm going to have to use a couple of different moving parts and pieces to be able to put that picture together? But sometimes just visualizing, and those are even conversations that you can have with some of your kids of what would it look like if you felt like you were rocking and rolling and you could do this without any help? What could you imagine that might look like? And that can kind of help them get a clear picture too of what they're going for with that mastery.
Mm-hmm. And also, yeah, I do think that holistic style of grading is important too, to kind of show your kids where they're making progress. And that consistency thing is a really important key word there. And I think if you can create rubrics, I always felt like, I know in the classroom that there were so many years that I'm like, why am I recreating this rubric every year? I know sometimes things have to be tweaked, but eventually I got to the point where I could create things that I could reuse and just retweak each year based on the needs of my kids or the standard changes or whatever came up there. So I would say simplify by creating rubrics that are authentic and can be used again or tweaked. Ensure grades are based on the learning objectives or your targets. So on that template, you'll notice a place for those learning targets. And I don't mean that one that we may think, oh yeah, this is like my weekly or my unit objective, but just breaking things down into measurable chunks. Like Katie said earlier, I think that measurable word is something that we don't always like reflect on enough to say, is this truly measurable today within a 45-minute period or an hour and a half or whatever time limit I have with my kids? What is a measurable objective? And I know that sounds crazy in a world where we have 90 million standards and all the pressure. And I completely understand that, you guys, but like if we're looking at it from the eyes of, or the lens of like what's best for me and what's best for my kids and is not going to drive me crazy or my kids crazy, what's measurable within a 45-minute chunk? And at the end of class, can I go back to that learning target with my kids and have them do some sort of mini self-assessment to just simply ask them, do you feel like you mastered this objective today? Why or why not? Because that's a good exit ticket for you to take away, another little formative assessment for you to inform your instruction the very next day. And you may not be able to do that every day. I completely understand. But I think a couple of times a week gives you valuable feedback from your students. And then
can I say one thing real quick, Lauren?
Please do. Mm-hmm.
So we get this question a lot, especially when we think about workshop instruction, where when we're teaching in more of like a workshop format, a lot of the things that kids are doing are really hard to assess. So if they're reading independently and they're practicing this skill in their book, or they're always like writing and drafting, what does that look like when we're trying to figure out mastery? that phrasing on the slide that says on-demand tasks, that's something that's really, really big for assessing some mastery with workshop, where let's say you're doing something where kids are working in their self-selected text to identify some character shifts or changes, or analyzing something, then an on-demand task would be to give them a shorter excerpt of text after they've had multiple practice, and have them do that same work with that shorter text in a timed frame. Or like if we're doing some writing with mentor text, where we've been practicing reading a text and finding some craft moves and then putting them into writing, then an on-demand version of that might be giving them a text and having them do that reading analysis with that text and doing those same steps, and then showing how they would use that text then in their writing. So sometimes if you have those ongoing workshop practices, it can be really hard to figure out, how do I take a grade? That you can do those like 45-minute on the spot, on demand, where they then apply and transfer what they've been practicing all along into that piece. And that's, Lauren's already talked about that, but again, giving them those multiple opportunities and planning that in advance of how kids will practice without the grade.
Yes, and I know that I want to honor y'all's time, so I'll kind of fly through the next piece a little bit, but one final thought, just also anticipating your student responses and misconceptions ahead of time so you can better differentiate in your lessons will also help you think about grading in a different way. And I know that we do a lot of that, but sometimes, I think in our world, we just don't have enough time to sit down and reflect on those things. And that was a huge aha for me, and it is with the teachers that I work with. When they anticipate kind of how their students may respond to certain parts of the lesson, it really helps them think about that grading in a new way and how they run their classroom. So and then I think we've self-assessment. So yeah, I think Katie's already touched on that. How will students play a role in their grades, those self-assessments? I think that's a really powerful thing. Like kids, I've even seen elementary kids, assess with emojis at the end of class, how are they feeling? I've seen high school teachers assess in a 9th grade classroom, like students rated their confidence, their curiosity, and their conversation levels based on a lesson. And that was really powerful. They had co-created some criteria with their teachers. And I did see something in the chat that spurred my attention, but I'm trying to remember what it was. But the exemplar. Yes, Rebecca mentioned creating exemplars. I think that is such a powerful way to like take the criteria you have and show them through an exemplar of what looks like the highest level of criteria, so that kids really understand how they're being assessed and graded. And so, yeah, go ahead, Katie. I'm good.
Just right now, with it is 11:01, so I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here. And